Coming up, are the Brooklyn Nets destined for postseason basketball following a 7-3 stretch over their last 10 games? And how could the return of their top offensive player influence that equation? I'll touch on all that and more after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Riding solo today for an episode diving into all the latest in Nets world: draft position, tank position, play-in position, all the latest players coming back, some of who has impressed lately. But before we get into all that, if you do not already, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, hit up my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you enjoy this video. Like it, comment. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. But we're coming off the All-Star break. The Nets have played 3 games since then. They are 1-2, but still playing some pretty good basketball. They lost to the Cleveland Cavaliers, a game that they led and was tight for a lot of. Then they pulled out a buzzer-beater win over the Philadelphia 76ers on Saturday at Wells Fargo Center. And then last night, they dropped a surprising game to the Washington Wizards down in D.C. But before I get into the draft position, all of what's going on with that conversation, it's just been interesting watching this play out because as I've documented on prior podcasts, the Nets were in that position where it looked like they were potentially going to get top lottery odds. And, they had that 2-15 stretch. It really seemed like they were going in a direction of committed to the tank. A lot of guys were injured, but they were losing games. And you thought maybe potentially as the season progressed, they could look to hold guys out. And that's how it's going. And then obviously they flipped it on its head over these last 10 games, posting a 7-3 record and really leaning into a defensive identity of being one of the best defensive teams in the league. And it's led to, a further splintering of the Nets fan base in terms of, is this terrible for us? They're potentially going to make the play-in. Oh my God, what if they made the playoffs? They could be out of the lottery. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's just led to the polar opposite ends of the spectrum of how you view the tank versus if you're pro-tank or anti-tank. And it's been somewhat disheartening for me because, it's unfortunate to see a team playing such cohesive, fun, intense basketball where they're all bought in. And the conversation, someone has to stray to something else, with it being their draft position and the tank. And I've been somebody who's talked about the tank at length, nearly every episode I bring it up because it's extremely relevant to this season. And I don't feel like you can cover this team and not go into that and talk about how this winning, influences their draft position and what they just traded to get their pick back. And all that stuff are the most relevant, most relevant parts of the equation. Now, are they the only part? No, but it's extremely relevant. So I've enjoyed watching this team over the last 10 games, the way that they've been playing, the, cohesiveness, the buy-in, the defense has really been a joy to watch. Nic Claxton, who I'm going to touch on later, really coming into his own. Trendon Watford stepping in and doing things to keep the team afloat offensively in crunch time. All those things have been a joy to watch, but it's all blanketed by, this shadow, this cloud over it of it hurting their draft position. And I've been very clear that it has, it is not a good development for the team, and hurting their draft position, I do feel like, is counterproductive. Now, what I haven't liked about that conversation is it strays so far in one direction or the other based on how you feel, whether you're pro-tank or anti-tank. The pro-tankers just like to disregard this completely and say, this is terrible, all these things, none of these guys are going to be on the team. And I've pushed back on those people, and I've said, well, you can't just disregard all the positives here. Jordi Fernandez is establishing an identity, not with these players, but he's proving that he can get players to buy into his philosophy. He's proving that players believe in the message and the way that he carries himself in this coaching staff. Because a lot of times you see on tagging teams, I've detailed this at length, a lot of guys check out. A lot of guys have coaches. Look what happens with Nick Nurse right now down in Philadelphia. It's different circumstances, but those guys are completely checked out. They are not picking up what he is putting down. And in Jordi Fernandez's case, in a taking situation that has not been optimal for much of this season, the guys are buying in. They, are taking to his message, and they're not looking at whatever he's saying and saying, oh, like, this is bullshit. Like, we're losing, like, screw this. No, they're really into it. And they've continued to be into it, and he's continued to hold them accountable throughout. So, his ability to get players to buy in not optimal circumstances, and his ability to overachieve with a group that many have presumed is, one of the worst in the NBA, That's not nothing. To say it's nothing is it's categorically insane to say that that's nothing. What is he going to do when he gets a high level roster? How does he look with some of the things he wants to do on both ends of the floor when you get some other players in here? It's a positive development in that sense. Now, I push back the other direction because there's the other side of it who says, who cares about the draft pick? We have 4, picks in the first round. We're still in a good position. And I've never strayed from the fact the Nets are in a good position. They lead the NBA in first round picks. They lead the NBA in cap space this coming off season. They have a lot of flexibility to go a ton of directions. They're still going to be able to get good players in the draft this year with their 4 first round picks. But I've been clear that, hurting the draft pick and the way that they've handled this to me in a lot of ways, over, more so in the beginning of the season when they didn't trade some of these guys away, has not made a lot of sense to me. And hurting that draft pick and landing in, the 7th, 8th, or 9th lottery spot, which it looks like they're going to. I'm going to get into that in a second. In my eyes, is, pretty disheartening after you thought that they were going to have a shot at a top 3 pick and a guy like Cooper Flagg or Dylan Harper, VJ Edgecombe, Ace Bailey, whoever you want to say, they're on the outside looking in. They can still get lucky. But after you traded all that they did to get this stuff back, I've been clear that I thought that they should have done more, taken more avenues to maximize that asset, which is their most premium asset right now. And they haven't done it. So point being, whichever side of the equation you land on, I think there's a tendency from both sides to completely disregard the positives or the negatives of the other. And what they've done so far, what they've done over these last 10 games, I should say, there are clear positives to it. And there are clear positives that I think translate to the rest of the NBA, mainly tied to Jordi Fernandez. But also we've seen some players, show flashes who could be with the team moving forward, or they could potentially be a trade piece moving forward. Like Nic Claxton is playing great basketball and getting back to the guy that a lot of people thought he could be going into the offseason, where there might be some interest, or they might like to look to, continue building this out with an aggressive move, and he could be part of that moving forward. So there are positives, both sides of whichever the equation you land on. And I think the tendency to disregard the other is unfortunate. And it's overall just unfortunate that we even have to worry about this. And you can't just focus on the play and enjoy what the Nets are doing, because there is this backdrop of their draft pick and how they could potentially be hurting it. And it's unfortunate, as I said, but it's the reality of the situation. So getting into the draft position of where the Nets are at, they lost this game on Saturday, as I said, or they won this game on Saturday. It's like almost a loss in my mind to the Philadelphia 76ers, which put them, they were tied for 6th in the lottery standings going into that. So that put them a game behind the 76ers for 6th. And they're now 1.5 ahead of the Bulls for 7th. The Bulls are in 10th place, so they're 1.5 behind in lottery standings, ahead in the lottery standings, but they're 1.5 behind of them for 10th place in the Eastern Conference, which is the final play-in spot. So that's significant because you look at the 76ers situation, and the Nets played this game in Philly on Saturday, and Joel Embiid is limping up and down the court. He looks like 40% of his normal self. It was really just sad to watch. His knee is buckling. Anytime he tries to do something, he's, falling down. He's like Gumby out there. He's flailing all over the place, way worse than anything he normally does, and no level of assertiveness to what he normally is. The effort wasn't great either. And the Nets and the 76ers lose to the Nets at the buzzer. Then they get blown out by 30, 40, whatever it was last night against the Chicago Bulls. And there's some comments from the 76ers about, Embiid sits this Bulls game. There's some comments about them seeking alternative paths, evaluating him, and that their pick is top 6 protected going to the Oklahoma City Thunder. So in my eyes, and from what the indications are from them, it should be a no-brainer that they should shut Embiid down and be tanking the rest of the season and do everything they can to retain that top 6 pick, which would mean, staying ahead of the Nets in the lottery standings. Then you look at the Bulls, who traded Zach LaVine at the deadline. They got back the protection on their pick. But once you trade LaVine, it's clear incentive and a clear signal that they're tanking the rest of this season. So they have incentive to maximize this draft pick. So there's a possibility, a very real possibility, where the Nets are falling behind. We were talking about them being in 5th place potentially, that being the spot they could be in the lottery standings. But with the 76ers and the Bulls both having clear plans, and with the way the Nets are playing right now, with about to get back Cam Thomas, something I'm going to touch on in a minute, it's very realistic that they could fall, to 8th behind the Bulls and the 76ers in this picture. And that could mean them getting into the play-in tournament, but that would be a tough pill to swallow for a team that, as I said earlier, many assumed was going to be at the top and at the front of the tank race for Cooper Flagg alongside a team like the Washington Wizards. To fall to 8th to 9th, and to maybe get into the play-in, something that, as I said, it has benefits, but there's a lot of guys in this rotation who are doing things right now who are definitely not going to be on the team long term. That's a tough pill to swallow. So, with the 76ers and the Bulls committing to that, the question becomes, are the Nets maybe going to take some measures to not fall that far, not fall further than that? And up to this point, they haven't shown any indication that they're going to do that, because, you look over these last 10 games and they're 7-3, and you look at, are they resting guys? Are they taking any measures? They haven't done it. Like, they've shown no indication that they're willing to take steps to handicap the roster and try to, stack losses. Because in this recent stretch, if guys are healthy, they're playing. Like, there's no rest nights. That's not a thing that's been happening. Nic Claxton, Cam Johnson, D'Lo, D'Angelo Russell missed these last 2 games, but that's because he had a legitimate ankle sprain that we all saw happen during a game. If he was healthy, he'd be out there right now. So these impact guys are playing. If they're not hurt, they're playing. And you look at other tanking teams, like I looked at the Utah Jazz's status report for their game yesterday or the day before, and it's every guy, John Collins, Clarkson, Taylor Hendricks, Lauri Markkanen, like all these guys are on the injury report. And I'm not saying some of them might have legitimate injuries, but I doubt every impact guy that they have on the roster is having, injuries on the same game. So like some of these teams are taking that measure. Those, like the Jazz are in the tank race at the top of the tank standings. The Nets aren't there, and they're not there because, while they're overachieving, and a lot of what Jordy's done, like they won this Philadelphia game with Killian Hayes starting at point guard and Trendon Watford as the main ball handler and Reese Beekman coming in there. So that's a credit to Jordy, but still, like the impact guys that are on this roster are playing. There's not a lot of rest nights, and they've, haven't signaled anything that they're going to try to slow this down and inhibit this team from going for that 10th seed and that play-in berth. So that's how it is out as it stands. And the really interesting end of the equation is Cam Thomas's impending return, because Cam has been out since January 2nd due to that hamstring strain. He missed 6 weeks earlier in the season. He returned for 2 games. In the second game, a road win in Milwaukee, he re-injured that hamstring, and he's been out since. But he returned to 5-on-5 scrimmages on Thursday for the first time since injuring his hamstring. And we asked Jordy about it before the Philadelphia game, and he said that Cam looked great in the scrimmages and that he was going to return soon. He missed last night's game in Washington, but based on how Jordy sounded and, the way that he was describing it and the way the timeline's been trending, I would not at all be surprised if Cam was either back for tomorrow's game, which is against the Oklahoma City Thunder at home, or they play on Friday and Saturday. One of those games, Cam being back, seems like the way that it's going to go. And once he comes back, it's a really interesting conversation, because this is a Nets team that has been unable to score the ball for the whole season. But over these last 10 games, they're 7-3, and they hold the NBA's worst offense, which is extremely unusual. You don't see teams ranked dead last in the NBA in points per game over a 10-game stretch, but be 7-3. And obviously, how they've been able to do that is they have the NBA's best defense. And Jordy Fernandez has done a great job of getting these guys to buy into a certain system. You have guys like Keon Johnson and Zaire Williams pressuring the ball. Nic Claxton, who I'm going to touch on in length in a second, is having a resurgence behind them and really anchoring the defense, and has looked like one of the NBA's top defenders during this month. So if you had that defense playing the way that they are, and you add, a score like this, it's going to lead to some more wins, you would think. Because you look at the game last night, the Nets lost to the Wizards, which is really funny because they're 7-3 over this stretch, and 2 of those losses have come to the worst team in the league, the Wizards. So that's very on par with how little sense this Nets season has made. But you look at the game last night, and they're trailing early. They come back, and down the stretch, they don't score from, I think it was 4:30 left in the game until like the final 15 seconds where they had a few free throws. They basically didn't score. I don't think they scored a field goal for the final 4 minutes and 30 seconds of the game. And if they had Cam Thomas in a scoring punch, there's a very realistic, possibility. I'd say it's likely that they win that game. So you add Cam Thomas to this defense that they have, and I think that if the other guys, Nic Claxton, Cam Johnson, stay healthy, if they get D'Angelo Russell back, it's going to look way more competent offensively, obviously, than it has during this recent stretch. Now, the Nets have also benefited from a little bit of a soft schedule during this recent stretch. And if you look at the upcoming schedule, look at the next 15 games. They have OKC, Portland, Detroit, San Antonio, Golden State, Charlotte, LA, Cleveland, Chicago, Boston twice, Atlanta, Indiana twice, and then Dallas. So in that stretch, I went through it. I'm penciling a bunch of games in there as losses already. OKC, the way Golden State's playing, probably them. The Lakers, Cleveland, 2 games against the Celtics, probably 2 games against Indiana. Like, it's going to get a lot more difficult. And we're talking about that 15-game stretch. I think it's tough to count this Nets team out because they've won some games during this recent stretch, like the Houston games, that Miami game, and even this Philly game that you didn't think they were going to. But this is a much tougher slate. And with Cam Thomas coming back, you can't count them out. But over these next 15 games, I think that 4 or 5 wins would be generous for that. I think that the only games in there that I have penciled in, or not penciled in, but are very, very winnable games are Charlotte and Chicago. Outside of that, they're all going to be difficult games. Maybe San Antonio also, but 4-11, 5-10, like that would be on the high end. So we're going to see some regression here. The question is, how do the 76ers do and how do the Bulls do? And based on how it's trending right now, those teams are both, it looks like, going to struggle mightily and maybe even outpace the Nets. So that's the conversation. That's the race that everybody's going to be looking at. On one end, the tank side, and on one end, the playing side, and everybody's going to be monitoring moving forward. And we'll see how Cam Thomas's return impacts that. D'Angelo Russell's probably going to sit out a little bit longer and then come back, but the Nets are going to have a little bit more competence offensively, and we'll see if they can keep up that defensive impact. And on the note of defensive impact, I'm just going to close this out by talking about 2 guys, and the first has to be Nic Claxton, because Claxton has anchored and led that first-ranked defense over these last 10 games. He's averaging offensively, he's averaging 12.1 points, which is look better on that end too, but 7.1 rebounds and 3.1 blocks. He leads the NBA in blocks during this month. And it's really been a combination of 2 things for me when I'm looking at Clax and why this resurgence has happened. Number one, he's getting healthy, it seems like, because during the beginning of the year, he was coming off the bench. He missed the whole preseason with that hamstring injury. And he also, after that, let us know that he was battling a back ailment all the way back to the summer, and he received an epidural for that early in the season, if you guys remember that. And Clax told us, that recently that he wasn't able to do a lot of working out over the summer. And he was really, had this debilitating back injury that took a while for him to get back. And he's starting to look like his old physical self, the guy we saw over these last 2 years. That's one part of it. Another part is the Nets have switched the defensive scheme, and he's done some things this year that he hasn't been used to. In the past 2 seasons, when we really saw him start to emerge as a defensive player of the year candidate, particularly in the beginning of that 2022-23 season, the Nets were switching everything. He was going onto the perimeter. He was locking down some of the top scorers in the league on those switches, and he really gained a lot of notoriety for that. But this season under Jordi Fernandez, the Nets have really altered that defensive scheme. And it's been very pronounced over these last 10 games where they're really going to a hedge or a blitz, mostly hedging. They played a little bit of drop coverage, but they've been hedging with Claxton and their big men. So when the pick and roll ball handler comes off the screen, they're kind of showing a little bit to the ball handler. When the big man rolls, they're having some guys on the back end take that away. And then they're having the guys behind him rotate to the open guys. And they're kind of, shading and hedging on the back end to take some of that stuff away. So that's really difficult, and it requires a lot of movement, not just from Claxton, from the whole rest of the team. But with this added health and this added juice and the pep in the step, the whole team looks a step faster, but Claxton particularly looks much faster, hedging and recovering to roll men, or hedging and, recovering to the basket for drivers or roll men, where he's getting blocks at the rim, going all the way from the top of the key down to the block. And, it seems like a split second. So he's looked much better. He has, it looks like, an added, motivation and juice with the Nets going for this play-in game, as does the rest of the team, all of them. And also Ben Simmons is gone, which I think is going to benefit him on both ends, particularly offensively, in terms of allowing him to have a little bit more of an open floor there, him being able to run pick and roll with some of these guys without somebody else clogging up the paint. So I think there's a lot of different factors in here that are fueling a Nic Claxton resurgence. And I think that it's really interesting because the Nets are going to be just, Claxton's under contract for a while so they can hold him, but they could potentially face some decisions this offseason. If some teams come knocking on the door and they want to look at him for a trade, if he continues to play really well, over the second half of the season, they could potentially get some offers that they might have to sit long and hard and think about. I'd be looking really hard at a team like the Los Angeles Lakers, who does not have a center right now. And Claxton, I think, they might want a little bit more beef in the middle, but he will add a lot of what they want in terms of rim protection, in terms of perimeter defense, to be able to hide Luka or Austin Reeves or whoever. He could add a whole nother layer and dimension there. So him playing well over the second half of the season, it, could boost the trade market for him, and it could give the Nets, put the Nets at a position where they have to decide, how do we feel about him long term? And is he a guy that we want to move off of and cash in on value now, or is he a guy they're going to hold for the long term of the rebuild? So that's what I've been seeing with Claxton. I think it's been a really positive development, and it's been nice to see, because early in the season he just looked like a shell of his old self. So health, added reps, all that stuff playing into that. Last guy I want to touch on before rounding this out is just Trendon Watford, because I think Trendon has been an extremely pleasant surprise, not a complete surprise, because we saw flashes of what he could do as a ball handler last season, but he has stepped in. He was out for most of the beginning of the season with a hamstring injury, similar to Cam Thomas. He was hurt, came back for a short period, then hurt his hamstring again, and he's been back for the last 9 games. But the last 6 games in particular, since Ben Simmons' buyout, Trendon has stepped into a lead ball handler role while playing with the second unit. He's been handling the ball for extended stretches of the game, really been a true point guard for a lot of these minutes. And over the last 6 games since Simmons' buyout, he's averaging, 14 points and 3.5 assists on 54% shooting. He's only playing 22 minutes per game, so he's averaging around 23 points per 36 minutes. That leads the NBA during that, leads the Nets during that stretch, And the way that he's been able to do it has just been really enjoyable to watch, because that Trendon was that small ball 5. He was playing that center role with the Trailblazers off the bench during his first 2 NBA seasons. And then he comes in last season, and it's like, oh, how are the Nets going to use Trendon Watford? He's this short roll guy. He's got this great floater. He can pass out of the short roll a little bit. And no, they deploy him as a ball handler. And you're like, oh, wow, this guy can handle the ball. He can do some of these things. He's kind of like this interesting gadget Swiss Army knife player. And I talked to Cam Johnson about it after the 76ers game, where Trendon really saved the Nets down the stretch. He scored 16 points in that game, and I think 9 of them were in the fourth quarter. He completely was the Nets offense down the stretch of that game, and he was really doing what he does. He was driving into the lane, using his body to get position, finishing that floater. He was probing in the pick and roll. He was facilitating. He was doing all those things. He struggled last night down the stretch. Marcus Smart really stepped up and provided really the jolt that the Wizards needed to pull that game out. And you're going to expect some struggles from Trendon down the stretch of the game, trying to be a lead ball handler in crunch time, because it's not something that he's done for a lot of his career, but he's shown capability to do it. So I asked Cam Johnson after the 76ers game, what makes Trendon's skill set so unique? And he obviously pointed to the size that he has, the touch that he has around the rim, that ball handling, the ability, the things he's able to do. And he said that it was funny because they only knew him as a center with the Trailblazers, and he came in here and they noticed very early, like, oh man, like he can handle, he's breaking guys down off the dribble. He's doing all this stuff that he never did with the Trailblazers, and it didn't seem like he was really allowed to do. So it's been fun to see him lean into that role and to blossom. And he's really been, like you talk about tank commanders, guys who command the tank. Everybody likes to joke about that, like this guy will lead losses and fuel losing and all that. Trendon's been a tank inhibitor. He really has. Since he came back, or just the whole season, he's 12. The Nets are 12-9 in games that Trendon has played, and 9-27 when he sat. Now, is that all him? Like, there's some other factors into those numbers, obviously, but they've been far better when he's on the court than when he's not. And I think that it's very obvious the reason for that is they don't have a lot of shot creation. And when you bring in a guy like Trendon, who can handle the ball, can create his own shots, can take some pressures off other guys offensively, it's a skill set that has been few and far between and really non-existent on the rest of the Nets roster. That's why you saw them lose so much straight after that Dennis Schroeder trade, and why some people were frustrated that D'Angelo Russell was part of the package coming back, because the easiest way to strip a team of its ability to compete is to take away competent ball handling and shot creation. And that is what Trendon has offered. And it's been an even more expanded role over these last 6 games since Ben Simmons' buyout. And Trendon's going to have a little bit of a runway. Like Cam Thomas is going to come back. He'll take some ball handler reps. But Trendon's going to have a runway in the second unit to have some primary ball handler responsibilities, and really has a solidified role there to close the season. And he's one of several guys that the Nets are going to face decisions on in free agency this summer. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent. And if he can continue to produce and show that he can, lean into this point guard development a little bit more, if he can improve some of his reads, become a little bit of a passer, if he can maybe take a few more threes off the dribble and off the catch, he could be a guy that could be a long-term fit here for the Nets. He's only 24 years old. So I think the expanded role, the way that Trendon's performed and the potential ramifications for the future, what it means for him just in his NBA player archetype and also for the Nets situation, I think has been very interesting. And like Claxton, he's a player that I'd be watching over the rest of the season because the Nets will, even more so than Claxton, definitely face a decision on him this offseason. And I think he's a guy that is just fun to watch and has a very intriguing skill set for this team. So we should see plenty more of Trendon as the season progresses, and it's going to be interesting to see, how he continues to develop with added reps and making more reads on a nightly basis in this point guard role. So that's going to be interesting to see, but that's all I have for you guys today. This is Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. As I said at the top, if you guys don't already subscribe to Believe in Nets, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Like, comment, anything you guys can do to engage is much appreciated. You guys can follow all my articles on ClutchPoints every single day, multiple articles. Also, follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ live game tweets, press conference clips, breakdowns, injury updates, all that. We're getting into the stretch run of the NBA season. There's contrasting sides of the play-in versus the tank race. I'll have more coverage of that here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.